welcome everyone. This conversation is called What Revolution? Systemic Racism, Sexism, Culturecide, and Genocide from America's Beginning. And it's part of a series that the organization that I work for, the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, is running this year up through July 4th. July 4th is the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And we are running this series as a response to what we're seeing from the federal government and from many groups and organizations in the private sector and general people who are celebrating the 250th anniversary of the United States of America, of the Declaration of Independence of the what would become the United States of America, in many different ways, but really celebrating it with this toxic nationalism. We're seeing the federal government launching this America 250 website, which has a huge number of corporate sponsors listed for America 250, which is just quite fitting and poignant for not only the founding of this country, but where it has gone ever since. I'm really looking forward to this conversation today. I'm going to introduce our speakers. I'll introduce myself briefly. My name is Max Wilbert. I am a community organizer. I'm the co-director of Community Resistance and Resilience with CELDF, the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. And we have three fantastic folks joining us today. Anne Keala Kelly, who is Kānaka Maoli, Hawaiian and Irish, is an award-winning filmmaker, journalist, writer, editor, podcaster, and activist whose work analyzes and advances Indigenous peoples' rights, cultural, environmental, and political resistance, and representation in media. Her print journalism and commentary has appeared in Indian Country Today Media Network, The Nation, Honolulu Weekly, Yes Magazine, Native Americas, Honolulu Civil Beat, and other publications. And her essays can be found in cultural and academic journals such as Oiwi, excuse me if I'm pronouncing that wrong, Keala, a Native Hawaiian journal, and American Indian Quarterly. Her broadcasting has aired on Al Jazeera English, the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer, Pacifica Network's Free Speech Radio News, Independent Native News, and elsewhere. And she has produced and hosted her own podcast and Substack column called The Native Truth. She was a regular contributor and occasional host on the internationally syndicated First Voices radio show with mutual friend Tiokasin Ghost Horse, and most recently had the honor to edit the catalog for Wasco Yakima artist Lillian Pitt's upcoming exhibition at the museum at Warm Springs. Keala is just amazing, a brilliant political thinker, a brilliant filmmaker. Her bio didn't mention her film, Noho Hewa, which is about the illegal and unjust occupation of Hawaii by the United States. I'm sure she'll speak more about the political reality of that colonization during the course of our conversation today. But I'm really glad to have Keala with us. I also want to introduce Dina Gilio-Whitaker. She's a descendant from the Colville Confederated Tribes. Dina is Assistant Director of the California Indian Culture and Sovereignty Center at California State University San Marcos. She teaches on environmentalism and American Indians, traditional ecological knowledge, religion and philosophy, Native women's activism, Native people in sports, and decolonization. Dina is the co-author with Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz of a book called All the Real Indians Died Off and 20 Other Myths About Native Americans, published in 2016. She wrote As Long as Grass Grows, The Indigenous Fight for Environmental Justice from Colonization to Standing Rock, published in 2019. And her most recent book, which just came out last year, is called Who Gets to Be Indian? Ethnic Fraud and Other Difficult Conversations About Native American Identity. I had the pleasure of doing an interview with Dina, what was it, earlier this year, Dina, after your latest book came out, focusing on that and some of your previous work, which folks who are watching on Substack, you may have seen that interview, and you can find it there and on the CELDF YouTube page. So very glad to have you with us as well, Dina. Thank you for being here. And then finally, my colleague Ben Price is also going to be part of this conversation. Ben is the education director at CELDF, and he's a pioneer in the rights of nature movement. In 2006, he organized the first community on Earth to recognize legal rights for nature in a Western legal system in Tamaqua, Pennsylvania. And in the decades that followed, Ben has continued organizing in scores of different communities to enact community rights and rights of nature legislation from a local grassroots perspective. In 2010, Ben was called into Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where he organized in the city's 9 district and lobbied city council representatives to draft and enact a ban on fracking and recognize the rights of local ecosystems to exist, flourish, and evolve. And he's also an author. His book, How Wealth Rules the World, Saving Our Communities and Freedoms from the Dictatorship of Property, was published in 2019. And he's also written a novel called Ogden, A Tale for the End of Time, published in 2023. His most recent book is a collection of essays called Wouldn't You Say, which we at CELDF published also last year. So I'm very glad to have the three of you with us. Thank you so much for being here, taking the time, and thanks for the folks who are watching here today and going to watch the recording afterwards. We have about just under an hour for this conversation. We may go over a little bit, but we're going to try and be respectful of people's time and keep things moving forward. But in preparation for this conversation, we had a call, the four of us, and we really started getting into the topic of a spiritual rift in worldviews between settler colonial culture when it came to this continent, and eventually led to the founding of the United States of America, and the worldviews that were present among the hundreds of different indigenous communities. So I want to start with Dina. I'm wondering if you could help us get grounded in this conversation about the Declaration of Independence and, how we should be looking at it as thinking people with the criticisms of the process of colonization through the lens of the doctrine of discovery, which it seems like kind of provided the moral and philosophical framework under which that colonization process was carried out. So, Dina, would you mind starting by helping to us to understand that process and how it began and how it has moved through American history?
Yeah, definitely. So those who are watching this, the audience here watching this may or may not be familiar with this thing that we call the doctrine of discovery. If you've got kind of a more in-depth and more critical, knowledge of American history, you might be more familiar with it. If not, it's not surprising, because there are probably lots of pretty high-profile historians even that don't know about what the doctrine of discovery is. But um, the doctrine of discovery is not something that would have been articulated or a known thing in 1776 when the Declaration of Independence was written. Not that it wasn't a philosophy or even an ideology. It just at that point, to my knowledge, hadn't been articulated as such at that point. But it definitely becomes articulated in American law fairly early on in its existence. By 1823 is when the justice of the Supreme Court argues the case Johnson versus McIntosh, and it's the first Indian rights case that ever comes before the Supreme Court, and it's about determining land law in the United States and titles of land in the U.S. And the court needed to answer the question about, certain questions about those lands that had come into settlers' hands. And in doing so, it needed to address the standing of tribes at that point. Of course, the country's only 50 years old at that point. And so so what it does is the court says that, and this is the sort of what this decision is known as, they say that tribes were necessarily diminished in their sovereignty, and I'm paraphrasing here, but they by the right of conquest, basically, they they are their rights have been diminished, and it's because of this idea that might makes right, and it's the beginning of the U.S. taking away tribes' rights to their own sovereignty, something that they don't consent to. And so the doctrine of discovery, but it has its roots in a much longer history that goes back to the Middle Ages, when the Catholic Church was making its, quote, in Europe, the Catholic Church controlled European empires were making their voyages across the oceans in this so-called age of discovery, and they come to new places, and they are armed with these things called these edicts called papal bulls, and they're a series of edicts handed down by various popes starting in 1455 that determine what's going to happen to the lands that they know that they're going to find and the peoples that are the inhabitants of those lands. And essentially what they do is they justify and rationalize the enslavement of those peoples by virtue of them not being Christians. They know that
Mm.
whoever they go and whoever they're going to find, they're not going to be Christians because they are undiscovered at that point. And so it's a very convenient, uh, a very convenient way of justifying the taking of lands. And so basically those lands get, in the Western Hemisphere, they get divided before they are even there. They get divided between Spain and Portugal. And so this sets up what becomes later known hundreds of years later as the doctrine of discovery. And so this, because it is the foundation of even of American property law to this day, and something that most Americans have no idea of. Property law is based on the systematic dispossession of Native people and the construction of them as inferior in order to rationalize the taking of land, and that becomes the foundation of what we call federal Indian law to this day, and then other doctrines that continue this pattern of justifying the taking of native lands and subjugating them unconsentingly to American law.
Mm. Mm. Thanks for that grounding, Dina. Keala or Ben, I'm curious if the two of you want to jump in. I'm thinking about claims to virtue and sort of how systemic racism gets built around. Because I mean, you're talking about 1455. Race as a concept didn't exist at that time, from my knowledge of history. Right? There were different ethnicities. There was xenophobia, certainly, but the system that we understand as race today
Yeah,
didn't really exist.
it's emergent at this time, and it begins, of course, in Europe with the Jewish Moors in Spain. And anyway, that's a rabbit hole I won't go down.
But I just want to add on to what Dina is saying about federal Indian law. It's the codification, in so-called law of ethnic cleansing, genocide. It feeds into this idea. If you look at a place like Australia, Captain Cook, who started there but ended here, terra nullius. They needed to claim that there were no humans on the land. The land is empty, and so I see. I think about disease as biological warfare, a way to clear the land. And then again, if we're talking about something like the Constitution or we're talking about federal Indian law, it's just the way that they've created the rules around through which they will dispossess, remove, erase these people. It's always about, I'm probably just jumping to some other part of this conversation by going right to the whole idea of this Constitution, but it's about taking from people. It's about erasing them and taking them. So whether it's doctrine of discovery or the things that came after that, and everything came after that as far as I can tell with what we're talking about here, it's always just geared towards this one goal: to dominate and control everything and everyone. And I do not believe that the agenda has ever become anything else. I think we're still living in that 500 years ago mentality.
What struck me when I first began to think about and learn about the doctrine of discovery was just what kind of a mental state that's describing. A doctrine of discovery. It's an admission of ignorance. Well, we didn't know there was even this land, this continent. We didn't know it was there. We didn't know these people were there, and we're discovering it. We're uncovering it, as though the people there have no agency of their own, no consciousness, no inner life of their own to, well, we've been here, we're alive. Certainly the argument was made that, well, by the Pope, essentially by the pontiff who declared that the Western Hemisphere would be divided in half. He drew a line from the North Pole to the South Pole on a crude map, and he said, well, to the east, that's Portugal's. To the west, that's Spain's. With absolutely no concern for the people who lived on that continent, what would become of them, whatever rights, whatever anything that were theirs. I think that the justifications, and I think it's true that there's always a need for justifying horrendous policies and activities. And that's so that in the eyes of those who don't know what's going on behind the curtain, things look like, well, we can at least tolerate it. It's not horrible. So the idea that, well, these natives aren't Christian, that they're not, that they don't have a concept in law of property, that there is no deed, no title to the land. So if there's no title, well, in our law from England and Spain and so forth, well, we can impose ours. Since they don't have one, we'll be the good guys and grant them and gift them with this legal system that we've developed over so many years. But it devolved too into the U.S. Constitution. The doctrine of discovery, you don't find those words in there. But what you do find is provisions that open up and allow for the territorial expansion of the United States. They put it in terms of admission of new states. But that just means the genocide and claiming of lands that are already occupied by Native people. That's the history is not taught that way. I know, and it certainly wasn't taught to me that way. But how can you discover something that's already been discovered by the people who live there? Number one. And so it's an admission of ignorance, and then ignorance used as a license to do harm. We still do it. We still do it in the environmental sphere, where the EPA says we don't have any evidence that this industrial process does any harm, therefore we're going to issue permits. In other words, until the harm is done, there's not going to be even a consideration of limiting it, regulating it in any way.
But Ben, I have to say, see, I hear what you're saying, but I don't know if it is ignorance. I don't think it is an admission of ignorance. I think it is an admission of cruelty and the word that they always applied to the natives, savagery. I think it is kind of like, one of the reasons I think this is an important conversation to have right now is because of what's happening right now in the world and what's happening in Gaza. I'm not the only one that goes around saying, wow, it's Wounded Knee Massacre every day in Gaza.
Absolutely.
It is the exact same project. It is European white people, settler colonial violence, genocide, ethnic cleansing. It is the exact same project with a different accent. So to me, even what you just said right now about the EPA, they effing know. They know. And
Yes. Yes, they do.
I believe us being polite and us acting or hoping for some kind of humanity to come out of these systems that have for centuries proven to be anti-nature, anti-humanity, anti-life. I think we're at a critical moment right now where, I mean, honest to God, Max, I was even just thinking about like the data centers. I mean, I know we're not here to talk about data centers, but I can't help but think about what you and Will did at Thacker Pass and how if people would somehow turn their attention to real resistance and look at what people are fighting for and help them or support them or at least understand what they're doing, the world would improve overnight if people would just look at the resistances going on everywhere instead of, oh my God, now there's 1,000 data centers upon us and they're all, 40,000 square miles, in size. Like it's like, if the boot is coming down on your neck, you need to take evasive action. I'm sorry, I know I cut in on something here.
And just to be clear, Miguel, I agree with you. The ignorance is actually the excuse. It's not actual ignorance. It's pleading ignorance.
They're lying.
I think it's even
lying,
more than.
yes.
I think it's more than that. It really points to the way that Europeans thought of themselves at that point, and the dividing up into hierarchies, these extreme stratification, and that's a worldview, right? That's an epistemological orientation to the world where you set yourself up as the pinnacle. Like if we to use the term social Darwinism, that describes this pyramid shaped hierarchy of human beings, where Christian Europeans, it's not even about race yet at that point, the late 1400s, early 1500s, it's about certain people seeing themselves as the pinnacle of civilization because of their religion. And that sets up this dynamic, this mental state that gives you the permission structure to go and do all these heinous things, to enslave other people, to kill them for their lands, and everything that's come after that. And we see that in, like Kayla was saying, the language of Indians as savages. And we see, to bring it back to the Declaration of Independence, we see that language enshrined in that document in the 27th grievance, where, because that's, let's listen, in terms of our history lesson here, that's what the Declaration is. It's a list of grievances against the King of England in order to justify the separation from the empire, from the English Empire. And the 27th grievance is about the colonists being angry that the king supported the Indians, the merciless Indian savages, in protecting their lands, which he was obliged to do in order to keep the colonists safe from them. Right. So the king couldn't win in that battle. He was trying to protect the colonists and to keep his word, however altruistic or not altruistic that was about. But you see that worldview of supremacy, of cultural, religious supremacy that the U.S. that we can see in the founding document, the Declaration of Independence, and everything that follows after that the U.S. is based on, which then gave rise to what we now call racism and xenophobia and all these other, things that maintain an inequitable system that has all these ongoing problems.
Dean, I wonder if in terms of that, the justifications and all the rest of it, and that hierarchy that you're talking about, when I look at the history of what happened in Europe just prior to the colonization and settlement and genocide in North America, what we saw was the enclosures, the privatization of the commons throughout England, Scotland, and Ireland. And it had to be based on a notion that was already established, that the Norman conquerors, their descendants were the nobility within England, and everyone else were commoners and really of no value to the sovereignty, and treating the Irish the way they did, and then using those people, rounding them up when they were dispossessed of their lands, and rounding them up and using them for free labor in the colonies when they sent them across the Atlantic, and to do their worst as well, to do their worst with the native population and claiming the land and expanding the European invasion beyond just the coastal colonies. I mean, that hierarchy of, there's a small class of people that deserve, to own everything, to privatize what shouldn't by rights belong to anyone. We're embedded in this system, this living system, this planet. And yet they come up with these rules, like the doctrine of discovery. There's always this, magic spell that they cast with words to say, well, see, and because of this law, we can justify it. Because of that law, we can justify it.
Yeah. I mean, and that's a good point that you're bringing up. And the argument has been made that settler colonialism was first initiated in England and Ireland, with the English pushing off, dispossessing the Irish of their lands and then moving the Scottish onto those lands. Of course, the English and the Irish and the Scots then start to intermarry. They become the Scots-Irish. They then become many of the colonizing population to the North American continent. And so they who were once the victims become, of English colonization, become the colonizers and the perpetrators of colonization, very much like I think we can arguably say about Israel, right? Where the survivors of the Holocaust then become colonizers and the perpetuators of genocide.
Right.
Yeah, I'm thinking about, I'm writing a paper right now based on Thacker Pass, working with a academic journalist or academic researcher, and peer-reviewed paper we're writing. And one of the new theories that was introduced to me in the writing of this paper was the term extractive subjectivities. And it's the idea that through gradual incorporation, assimilation from more land-based, reciprocal ways of being in land-based indigenous, cultures, peasant cultures, subsistence cultures around the world, through the process of colonization and integration into extractive economies, there is a process not only of the external colonization of land, the seizure of land, the shift from a previous economy to a new colonial economy, but that starts to have impacts on people internally, that people's subjectivities become to reflect the culture itself. And that this is itself an extension of the process of colonization. It's part of the violence of colonization. And it's an interesting topic to me because it seems like this violence is a big thing that we're talking about here throughout. And maybe y'all can respond to this. Maybe Kel, I'll ask you to start, because it seems like to me the argument that we're all making is that the violence of colonization that began 500 years ago on this continent has continued up to this day, that it's changed forms, that it may look different in some ways today than it did. But it seems like there are sort of different phases beyond just initial sort of military conquest and land seizure. There's these different phases of cultural genocide and assimilation and so on. And Keala, living in Hawaii as you do and having your heritage there, that was added under the mechanisms that Ben talked about earlier to the United States, more recently than anywhere else. So could you talk a little bit about sort of these sequences of colonization and how they played out, all sort of under the auspices of this Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, and this language of, freedom?
Mm-hmm. Wow. I mean, there's so many ways into something like that. I think if we're just sort of talking about 250-year anniversary of this document that has its own narrative. It has a narrative of media plays a huge role, because media, even before mass media like we have now, even before the technological way that we do media like we're doing right now with our computers and phones, it's always played a huge role, because it cleanses the narrative, it creates the narrative, it perpetuates a certain narrative. The narrative of the 250 years of a Constitution that, all Americans are getting ready to celebrate, which is so mind-blowing to me. But the narrative itself, it's based on dehumanizing people. It comes from a history of these people who came from Europe, who, when they left Europe, had already deforested and destroyed so much of their own nature just to get these ships and become these, they weaponize nature, they weaponize everything. So we have 250 years of that tradition, which began in Europe. It maybe morphs and changes forms as it encounters the different peoples in the places it's going to eat like termites. In these 250 years, I don't think we've even had 20 years where America wasn't at war. Think about that. That means war is the beating heart of America. The United States of America is war. It is its beating heart. It is the thing it pumps blood for. If after 250 years, you don't even have 20 years where you were at peace, you're just a serial killer nation. You're just a monstrosity that will not change for anything or anyone. So, if you start 250 years ago to where we are now, we have over 800 U.S. military bases outside of the U.S. One of the reasons Hawaii is so significant, to try to bring it back to where I'm at right now, is because this is a nation state. The Hawaiians went in. Once Western influence came into Hawaii and the Pacific, culturally, economically, Hawaiians created what became known as the Hawaiian Kingdom, which was the first non-white populated nation state. And what happened in the 1890s and 1893 at the overthrow was the U.S. began was already influencing far before that, but the U.S. began the process of taking over a nation state. This is ground zero for the colonization of the globe that we are all dealing with today. Hawaii is literally ground zero for the militarization for these 800 military bases. Whenever people talk about all these military bases, bring our troops home, they've already ingested and absorbed Hawaii into their intestinal tract. We don't belong in there. Not under any legal system, not under any cultural system. We do not belong there. This is where the United States began the takeover of the globe. And people need to acknowledge that and respect that, because until that happens, it's never going to be made right. So this is an illegally occupied nation state. It is one of the most militarized places on Earth. It is home to the largest military command on Earth. And so if we're talking about the things we're all talking about these days with what's going on in the Middle East, you have to look at the Pacific. You have to look at Hawaii as where that started. And Americans just don't want to do that, because Americans still want to have a place to take a vacation. They want to pretend that we like them coming here. They want to pretend, it's again, the narrative of the Pacific, of Hawaii, of the United States has always been a lie. And that lie is costing everybody. And I'm just talking about the lie about Hawaii and the Pacific. There are so many other lies before that. But so, I don't know if I'm really addressing what you're saying, but I do want to link where we're at right now and where we were hundreds of years ago to Hawaii and the role that Hawaii plays. And it is a military role, Max. It is militarism. It is murder. It is massacre. It is weaponizing and terrorizing. And it is theft. It is theft of water, land, culture, identity, life itself. And I know I sound, I'm not an academic. And I tend to look at this stuff, I guess, in a sort of personal way, because I see it happening all around me. I see the cost to the Hawaiian people. I see how we've been absorbed and how so many Hawaiians have just decided to go full on assimilation at this point. And so much is at stake right now that I can't even begin to speak to those things, So it's a really perilous time, but I also think it's a really good time to talk about this 250-year. What do Americans like to say? Oh, it's an experiment. No. Well, they're experimenting on us, like scientists in a lab experimenting on rats or something, but it's an agenda. And it is, and I can't see it another way. I haven't been able to find another lens to look at it through. It is an agenda of white supremacy. It's an agenda of male supremacy. I'm sorry, Dina, please jump in here.
Okay, I was just going to say it's an experiment in settler colonialism, right? I mean,
how to do it differently in every place that they encounter, right?
Yeah, because it's ongoing, and we can say, what we can say about that for a second is that, because I am an academic, when the way that we talk about it in an analytical sense is that settler colonialism, what we have in the U.S., what you have in Hawaii, to an extent, you have settler colonialism in that case combined with military occupation. So it's a very unique kind of settler colonialism, I think. But settler colonialism, we say, is something that does it, compared to other places like in Africa, in Asia, in other places where colonialism happened, it's a different type of colonialism that happens here because it doesn't end. Right? We don't have decolonization movements like we see in Africa and Asia, where the colonized kick out the empires and the colonizers, and now they form their own governments. It doesn't happen that way here. Settler colonialism is said to be an ongoing reality. So settler colonialism exists to replace the native, right? It eliminates the native. Eliminates the native in order to replace with new populations. And so, in that sense, I think it's an ongoing experiment about ongoing colonization and how you can continue to erase and make genocide structural, as Patrick Wolf said.
Max, if you don't mind, I wanted to bring it back just a little bit to the declaration and Dina, the grievance number 27 in it that you mentioned, where it lists those 27 essentially justifications for separation from the British Empire. And the last of them, I think, is probably the only one that actually has been dealt with by the U.S. government that replaced the British rule, and that is that it says that the king, as the embodiment of the empire, allows the savage Indians to attack. In matter of fact, invites them in to attack the colonists. Well, the British king had signed a treaty with the Iroquois Confederacy after the French and Indian War was concluded, and said, well, we're not going to allow settlers to go west of the Appalachian Mountains. And the reason wasn't altruism. It was because the British were exhausted and broke after the French and Indian War, which is the 7 Years' War in Europe. happening as it happened in North America. But the point I wanted to make was the it's not even irony, it's something much worse than irony, that the accusation that that's how Native Americans, had to be seen, it could be used as future justification for the westward expansion and the treatment of Native peoples, that kind of attitude, and I know that it was in some instances specifically, but what my reading of history and the French and Indian War was that George Washington was a British commander in that war, and he gained a nickname from the Seneca nation, who were part of the Iroquois Confederacy, and they called him Town Destroyer. There's different translations, Town Destroyer, but town, just ravisher, and accused him of killing men, women, children, old people, and everything that stood was leveled. And yet that is his character, and we find it in the Declaration of Independence as a justification for severing the relationship with the empire, accusing Native Americans of doing what this man had actually been known for and named for uh, prior to the revolution. And by the way, after it as well, on the Sullivan expedition in the revolution, the same treatment that he gave to Native communities and the same name was resurrected for him. Oh, by the way, and for his father as well.
It's all a massive projection,
Yes, that's the point.
right?
And that's, I really wanted to say, that's the thing. It's like there's a psychological side to all of this madness, this colonization, settlement, and genocide. There's a psychological pathology to it. And that kind of projection just came easily to them, apparently, to do that, to use those words in a Declaration of Independence, knowing that the man who was calling for this revolution so that he could hold on to his land holdings west of the Alleghenies, it was his horrible character, his horrible personhood that was reflected in those words, not the people who were originally here. Projection. I agree.
Again, just like now, Washington would have a whole lot more in common with Netanyahu than he would with any of us guys,
Boy,
because
that's true.
it's just about murderous rampaging. The difference between then and now is that we're actually being able to see it live streamed. But, murdering people is still murdering people, And also one word we haven't used, but I'm going to use it, is rape. It's a rape culture. It is a rape mentality. And it has never not been that. And I'm always kind of like, I want to get to the part where what are we going to do? And I always think there is something to do, right? I always think there's a way to be empowered, and there's a thing that can be done to dismantle these systems of domination, and the psychological hold that it has on people, because people are really slaves to consciousness more than they are to other things. That other stuff is secondary. It's about what's your paradigm that you live in, what's your consciousness. I've more than once heard where we're at right now as a species, a spiritual war. For Native peoples, it's always been a spiritual war, because one of the first things they do is they come in and they desecrate that which is most sacred to us, that which is our source for survival.
And
so
suppress your religion.
Say again?
And suppress your religion.
Yes.
Completely ban it.
Yeah. I mean, so it's, I know we have a limited amount of time. I'd really love to hear. I mean, I'm just going to take over, Max, for a second. Excuse me while I grab your, moderator microphone. But I do want to hear because I'm out of ideas. and I want to know where can we go, because I feel like things have really changed in the past few years, and the world is still on the verge of World War III as we speak. So I really would love to hear anybody's thoughts on what to do in this crazy year where Americans are going to be just celebrating this absurd fictional narrative of themselves.
And Keala, that they're not even celebrating what happened in 1776. To say that it was the beginning of the United States of America is false. It was not a war. It was not a revolution. The war was not a revolution. It was a revolt. But it didn't change the way things are done. It didn't change the hierarchical system. One was replaced with a different one. But it was 13 years later, in 1776, the settler population had some options opened up to it, had some opportunities to do things differently, and maybe things would have turned out differently had they done that. And, and not to lionize anyone, any of the settlers, actually an Englishman who came over during or just prior to the revolt was Tom Paine, and he wrote Common Sense. And it was a critique of British government, the British hierarchical society, not just government, but the whole social system. And it was a critique that was inspiring to common settlers. I mean, the folks who didn't come from good families, so to speak, and didn't own a lot of land and didn't own slaves and worked for people in order to get by. They didn't have land, but they were inspired to join an army the way that the new model army was under Cromwell. Let's take out this king. Let's get rid of this hierarchical system. We had the levelers and the diggers 100 years before the American Revolution coming up with some of their best lines in the U.S. were that not even the U.S. then, taxation without representation, government at the consent of the governed. All of that stuff came out 100 years before. I mean, there has been a war going on, and it is a spiritual war if part of your spirituality, as it is for indigenous people, and I speak not from firsthand knowledge, obviously, but from what I've been learning, not to speak for either of you or anyone else, but the idea that we're not separate and superior to the natural world. We're not separate and superior to other people who live closer to nature, to the natural world, the living world. We're actually integral and part of it, and and we are related by everything. The air of the earth is in my lungs now and letting me speak and letting me live. There's no way I can say I'm separate from nature and apart from it. There is a paradigm difference that's severe. But when I think about what that paradigm difference is, it was manufactured. It was manufactured in Europe to justify things like the enclosures, the theft of what was the commons, and the invasion and occupation of India and Ireland and North America and South America and all of it. I mean, but it was a departure from the way people in Europe had lived for eons, close to the soil, close to the land, other than that self-appointed, aristocracy of power.
I mean, the argument can be made and has been made by many a deep thinker, that really that paradigm shift occurs much earlier, and it's a religious paradigm shift, beginning with the Bible. And that's a whole other can of worms, but I would say even more specifically with the Abrahamic religions. So, that's of course what the Bible emerges out of is if we trace it back to the book of Genesis as the beginning of the Old Testament, where this paradigm is first articulated, and, God's commandments to Adam and Adam and Eve to spread out, and to dominate the natural world. I mean, the language is all there. It sets up this permission structure and the hierarchies where humans are at the top of the pyramid. And I know that there are some, Christians now who reject that thinking, and they see other things in the Bible that refute that, but and that's great. I think there's a progressivism there, but overall, in Christianity is the roots of this hierarchical thinking that separates humans from the natural world and puts, frames them as like the boss of it, the dominators of it. And that's where, everything falls from there. And arguably, that's, I say, how we get climate change, because you have an entire world of technology that gets created based on this worldview of humans being at the top of the food chain, so to speak, and developing the types of technologies that lead and economies that result in the gobbling up of the natural world, the rejection of living in balance with the natural world, and without any kind of respect or sense of reciprocity or anything like that. So, I mean, that's going down another rabbit hole, but it's all tied together. It's all connected.
Yeah, just want to share a quick story. Actually, when we had our prep call, when was that? 3-4 weeks ago. I was actually joining you all from a park near my home where I'd gone to do some work and hang out outside and enjoy the sun. And as I was on that call, there was there were prisoners with the sheriff who were there, who'd been brought to do some work removing non-native species. And so that was happening right behind me. And what was so interesting was that as we're having our conversation, the sheriff, they take their lunch break and then they're walking back up behind me. And the sheriff is talking to, he must be a deputy, is talking to one of the prisoners as they're walking back up the hill to continue their work. And he's talking about how, the reason we have such a big wildfire problem now is because all these environmentalists, after the Northwest Forest Plan came into effect, were able to halt so much of the logging, and now there's way too many trees and it's all overgrown, and we need to log way more to solve the the fire problem that we have. And it was just so interesting to me as a microcosm of the situation we find ourselves in, where you have the person who's in prison. I don't know who these prisoners are, what they've done, or I'm not trying to excuse, people's behavior, but nonetheless, there's a lot of problems with the prison industrial complex, as we know. And just the representative metaphor there of this sheriff's deputy talking about how we need more, really educating this person, talking very friendly to this prisoner, educating him about how we need more logging to help, quote unquote, to help the environment by reducing wildfires, which of course, in the Pacific Northwest, fires are natural and have always happened, and they're being intensified by global warming to some extent. But they're still, they're demonized as this evil force, right? Evil nature.
And there's a grain of truth in what he's saying, though, when he's talking about the mismanagement of forests, right? Like, that is a fact. I mean, once we get this whole approach, going back to, Aldo Leopold and Gifford Pinchot, and this whole utilitarian approach to managing forests for capitalistic purposes, forest as a resource, that's when we see that in California. But it's not, the answer is not more logging. It's better management of forests for sure. But the twisted logic of that, like, there's, it's partly true, but he takes it in completely a whole, like, wrong direction.
Sort of the Vietnam era thing. We had to destroy the village to save it. We have to destroy the forest to save it, to clear cut it.
Or,
Because if you have a clear-cut forest, there's no fire.
But it's also like, a dead Indian is a good Indian, right? It's
Right.
the slave, it's the middleman in the slavery economy talking to the slave labor prisoner, right? Whose slave labor is coming from an industry that actually was born out of slavery, right? The prison industrial complex began after slavery was abolished. So it's just fascinating that hundreds of years later, it's the exact same system, and walking past you as you're sitting in a park and you see it played out. Here's the overseer for the master of the slave, basically, explaining to the slave what's really wrong with the world. You
It's
cannot make that up.
Yeah, it's that extractive subjectivities idea that I was just talking about, how the extractive mindset becomes internalized, is taught through culture and weaponized. But I really want to get to, we should probably wrap up here. We're about an hour. We can go over a little bit if it's okay with you guys, because I really want to try and address your question, your comment, Keala. That was actually how I planned to wrap up this conversation too, was to talk about the reality that we're facing. I was born into what's now the United States, born into this world with climate catastrophe, with the sixth mass extinction, with, live stream genocide, with war, with, rising, more virulent forms of authoritarianism, with sort of a vapid mass culture, mass media culture, and the rise of AI and social media and the impacts that that's having on collective consciousness and psychology, mental health, and sort of society's ability to cohesively address any problems. So, it all seems really bad, and it is. And, as you ask, Kayla, and maybe I could share my own thoughts too, but I'd love to hear from you three. Where do we go from here? And, obviously all of us are very active as organizers, as activists, as educators, working to have conversations like this, raise people's awareness and consciousness of these issues, which seems like part of the path forward. But, beyond that, Dina, Ben, Cal, yourself, where do we go? What do we do in the face of this?
Well, I'm going to just speak, and I want to hear what I'm going to speak very quickly. That's to say, I think one of the things that the settler population needs to do is change the way they see the world, and that doesn't happen overnight. It happens generationally, and we have to start somewhere, and there's no time like the present. So a project like America 250, from a revolutionary perspective, the reason to do it at all is to try to correct some of the misperceptions, some of the a lot of lies. There's been a lot of lies, and they are part of the culture. The culture is built on a castle of lies, and your assistance in exposing that maybe will go some distance in bringing us to where we can do something about it. Under current circumstances, I'd say we're doomed. So we better get busy changing the outcome by changing what's going on between people's ears. That's generally how I see it. That's a real short answer for it, though.
I'll jump in next. I want Keala to have the last word, but to build on what Ben said, I totally agree. I think it's generational, which is scary because I think we're running out of time. Knowing what we know about climate change and all of that, but and because it's generational, it's also an educational project. So if we understand, if we see it in terms of the future, that means we have to change the minds of beginning with children, and that's done through education. So we need systemic change in our education systems in order to raise their awareness. I see some of that happening, probably not nearly enough, not quick enough, not on a large enough scale. But that's because I'm an educator. That's how I see it, and that's my part in the whole thing.
Well, I asked the question because I have less hope than all of you guys. I feel really quite hopeless right now, looking at the way things are where I live, looking at the way things are in the world, and the apathy, which I actually have come to understand more as a psychological kind of frustration people have, and they sort of just shut off. I mean, they turn off anyway, but now there's almost like people are almost like zombies. They just have no faith in themselves, in their own ability to free themselves from this social economic trap that everybody's in. People are struggling for money. And when you get into a struggle with money, you're going to do one of two things. You're going to, periscope up and find a different level of consciousness about it, or you're going to succumb to the system and just do whatever you can do to get it. And then you're going to rationalize that. That's what I see Hawaiians doing. They rationalize the pimping of our culture. They rationalize the selling us out to Apple TV for $340 million that went who knows where. They rationalize trying to climb further up the hairy ass crack of Uncle Sam into the federal recognition system that natives are trapped in. This becomes you can rationalize anything once you get to the point where you're like, well, I have to survive. And I think the only thing I can see, and I don't know if it'll work, and I don't know if it even matters, but what I can see as truth is that people need to consider, as individuals, if we're going to be individualistic about this, it should only be starting from the point of, where's my soul? Do I still have my spirit? Do I still have my mind? Do I still have my sanity? And what does that, and really care more about that than about money. Because nobody's rent is more important than anybody else's rent. Nobody's mortgage is more important than anybody else. It's no different. And so this idea that, people, I see people incrementally selling their souls just to survive. And that's already, you're not going to survive. You can't survive in anything that's like that. So I know that it sounds nutty and I hate to even use these words, but we have to dismantle these systems. And so if in the educational process or the learning process or the being process, we can't look around and go, well, that's wrong. What can I do personally to dismantle that? We have no hope. And if people, at least as individuals, start to look at their impact, where they are right now, what kind of power they can find that isn't about shoring up the power of that system, but is really about dismantling it, then perhaps people will start to look around at other resistance movements and see where we can connect. Like, I'll look at certain things. I look at union stuff. I used to be so pro-union, and I'm like, I don't know if I even care anymore. I mean, I get it, but it's such a messed up system, and technology is going to take away so many jobs anyway. At this point, we should be looking at places where we can connect with other movements. And hopefully, one thing and this is one of the reasons I feel a little bit hopeless, is because oftentimes those movements won't want to connect, with the Native movement. One of the things I always loved about Deep Green Resistance was you guys were out there first on the line with the Natives. I always had complete respect for that, because so many of these environmental organizations don't really connect with Natives. And it's got to start there. It's got to start with, who were the first people of the place where you are? And then lastly, I would say, and this is, I think, a biggie, don't bed down with institutional people. I mean, I can understand the need for education, but if your whole world and life is dependent on the state, on the government, as a person who's about resistance, I'm not going to want a piece of that. Because if people are completely dependent on their oppressor, they're not going to help me. They're not going to help anybody that's going to dismantle that. I always say this, and it sounds so boring to just always quote, and it's Audre Lorde, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. American law, culture, values are there to maintain the American power. And we're never going to find anything in there that's going to loosen up a few of the bolts. We need to find alternative ways to do that. And I'm hoping that'll come from people finding their own humanity, because right now, God help us, I feel like that's what's really missing, is people have lost their way. We've been indoctrinated with a crazy form of propaganda media that just makes people confused, and they don't even know. A genocide, does it matter? They actually wonder about that. And that to me means we've lost our humanity. Without our humanity, we don't stand a chance. On that note, that's like the best I can come up with, Max.
Thanks, Keala. Yeah, that's very well said. And I agree. I'm with you. If there's one thing that gives me, I don't know if hope is the right word, but gives me strength and vitality and helps the fire continue to burn within me. It's that, my experience has been that when we align ourselves with the land and with the water and with the air and with the non-human life, then, not only are we sort of coming from a morally right place, which has its own strength, but I think we recognize the fact that we have the strongest ally imaginable. I know you're in Hawaii, and I heard a story from friends there years ago about a controversial housing development that got built, and then the volcano erupted, soon afterwards, and a lava flow came down and destroyed that housing development. When people build on the floodplains, those houses are going to get flooded out. When you burn fossil fuels and you destroy the forests and you plow the Great Plains and release all that carbon into the atmosphere, you're going to pay for it. There's no way around that. And it seems to me like we have a very simple choice in the end, which is either we align ourselves with life and this planet, or we fight against it. And the dominant culture, as exemplified by the United States of America, has chosen to fight against it in every possible way, essentially. And that's a battle that it will eventually lose, because unsustainable means it will not last. It's not physically possible for it to last. So I think my optimism lies in aligning ourselves with these processes that we're so dependent on, with the miracle of life on this planet, the miracle of this reality that we live in, and acting in accord with that, rather than seeing it as something evil to be contained and controlled and exploited and extracted from. And I think you're absolutely right. All three of you, but Keala, the words I'm remembering that you said about that extractive process, and how that our approach changes so much when our minds are free, from the influence of that dominant culture, that extractive, colonizing, aggressive, imperialistic culture. Then I think people can make good decisions. Those decisions aren't easy in this world, because, like you said, there's always the forces pushing us towards compromise, work within the system, get your paycheck, don't rock the boat, don't be radical, just work for a little incremental change, rather than actually fundamentally challenging the system as a whole. And I know you all run into that in your work, as do I, very regularly. But that's all I've got. Do you guys have any final words that you want to share before we wrap this up?
I think we could probably go on and on forever.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I want to say mahalo nui loa for having me on the show today. I think this was a great conversation to have. I think it's important to at least try to problem solve a little bit when we talk about the problems. And I also really appreciate you folks for just right out in the open, just taking on this BS narrative of this 250-year anniversary of the U.S. Constitution and really unmasking it for what it is and always has been.
I want to share my deep appreciation to both of you, Dina and Keala, for being here and sharing your perspectives. And I hope we'll be having more conversations in the future. And Max, thank you very much, too, for keeping us all on track.
Ditto, Leela. Thank you for making the space for us to have this conversation. And it's all a process of learning and unlearning. And in order for us to get to that place of dismantling, like Keala was saying, we have to know what we're dismantling. But we also have to be able to imagine new things to construct in its place. And what will those systems be? What are we working towards? And that requires vision.
But take action even if you don't have the vision. Go for it anyway. Be a poet. Be your own poet every day, and just go for it, because we have the power of imagination. If we can get ourselves out of the prison, we will find we will know what to do. we will know what to do. I will trust the wisdom of our elders to tell us what to do. Anyways, I'll stop. You guys are awesome. This is great. Appreciate it.